This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 57. The unripe grape, the ripe and the dried. All things are changes, not into nothing, but into that which is not at present. Marcus Aurelius. Deeds are the pulse of time, his beating life, and righteous or unrighteous being done, must throb in after-throbs till time itself be laid in darkness, and the universe quiver and breathe upon no mirror more. In the evening she sent for him again. It was already near the hour at which she had been brought in from the sea the evening before, and the light was subdued enough with blinds drawn up and windows open. She was seated gazing fixedly on the sea, resting her cheek on her hand, looking less shattered than when he had left her, but with a deep melancholy in her expression, which as Deronda approached her passed into an anxious timidity. She did not put out her hand, but said, "How long ago it is!" Then, "Will you sit near me again a little while?" He placed himself by her side as he had done before, and seeing that she turned to him with that indefinable expression which implies a wish to say something, he waited for her to speak. But again she looked toward the window silently, and again turned with the same expression, which yet did not issue in speech. There was some fear hindering her, and Deronda, wishing to relieve her timidity, averted his face. Presently he heard her cry imploringly, "You will not say that any one else should know?" "Most decidedly not," said Deronda. "There is no action that ought to be taken in consequence. There is no injury that could be righted in that way. There is no retribution that any mortal could apportion justly." She was so still during a pause that she seemed to be holding her breath before she said, "But if I had not had that murderous will, that moment, if I had thrown the rope on the instant, perhaps it would have hindered death?" "No, I think not," said Deronda slowly. "If it were true that he could swim, he must have been seized with cramp. With your quickest, utmost effort, it seems impossible that you could have done anything to save him. That momentary murderous will cannot, I think, have altered the course of events. Its effect is confined to the motives in your own breast. Within ourselves our evil will is momentous, and sooner or later it works its way outside us. It may be in the vitiation that breeds evil acts, but also it may be in the self-abhorrence that stings us into better striving." "I am saved from robbing others. There are others. They will have everything. They will have what they ought to have. I knew that some time before I left town. You do not suspect me of wrong desires about those things?" She spoke hesitatingly. "I had not thought of them," said Deronda. "I was thinking too much of the other things." "Perhaps you don't quite know the beginning of it all," said Gwendolen, slowly, as if she were overcoming her reluctance. "There was some one else he ought to have married, and I knew it, and I told her I would not hinder it. And I went away. That was when you first saw me. But then we became poor all at once, and I was very miserable, and I was tempted. I thought, I shall do as I like and make everything right. I persuaded myself, and it was all different. It was all dreadful. Then came hatred and wicked thoughts. That was how it all came. I told you I was afraid of myself, and I did what you told me. I did try to make my fear a safeguard. I thought of what would be if I felt what would come, how I should dread the morning, wishing it would be always night, and yet in the darkness always seeing something, seeing death. If you did not know how miserable I was, you might But now it has all been no use. I can care for nothing but saving the rest from knowing. Poor mamma, who has never been happy." There was silence again before she said with a repressed sob, "You cannot bear to look at me any more. You think I am too wicked. You do not believe that I can become any better, worth anything, worthy enough. I shall always be too wicked to—" The voice broke off, helpless. Deronda's heart was pierced. He turned his eyes on her poor beseeching face and said, "I believe that you may become worthier than you have ever yet been, worthy to lead a life that may be a blessing. No evil dooms us hopelessly except the evil we love, and desire to continue in, and make no effort to escape from. You have made efforts. You will go on making them." "But you were the beginning of them. You must not forsake me," said Gwendolen, leaning with her clasped hands on the arm of her chair and looking at him, while her face bore piteous traces of the life experience concentrated in the 24 hours, that new terrible life lying on the other side of the deed which fulfills a criminal desire. "I will bear any penance. I will lead any life you tell me. But you must not forsake me. You must be near. If you had been near me, if I could have said everything to you, I should have been different. You will not forsake me?" "It could never be my impulse to forsake you," said Deronda promptly, with that voice which, like his eyes, had the unintentional effect of making his ready sympathy seem more personal and special than it really was. And in that moment he was not himself quite free from a foreboding of some such self-committing effect. His strong feeling for this stricken creature could not hinder rushing images of future difficulty. He continued to meet her appealing eyes as he spoke, but it was with the painful consciousness that to her ear his words might carry a promise which one day would seem unfulfilled. He was making an indefinite promise to an indefinite hope. Anxieties, both immediate and distant, crowded on his thought, and it was under their influence that after a moment's silence he said, "I expect Sir Hugo Mallinger to arrive by tomorrow night at least, and I am not without hope that Mrs. Davilow may shortly follow him. Her presence will be the greatest comfort to you. It will give you a motive to save her from unnecessary pain?" "Yes, yes, I will try. And you will not go away?" "Not till after Sir Hugo has come." "But we shall all go to England?" "As soon as possible," said Deronda, not wishing to enter into particulars. Gwendolen looked toward the window again with an expression which seemed like a gradual awakening to new thoughts. The twilight was perceptibly deepening, but Deronda could see a movement in her eyes and hands such as accompanies a return of perception in one who has been stunned. "You will always be with Sir Hugo now," she said presently, looking at him. "You will always live at the Abbey, or else at Diplow?" "I am quite uncertain where I shall live," said Deronda, coloring. She was warned by his changed color that she had spoken too rashly, and fell silent. After a little while she began, again looking away. "It is impossible to think how my life will go on. I think now it would be better for me to be poor and obliged to work." "New promptings will come as the days pass. When you are among your friends again you will discern new duties," said Deronda. "Make it a task now to get as well and calm, as much like yourself as you can, before—" He hesitated. "Before my mother comes," said Gwendolen. "Ah, I must be changed. I have not looked at myself. Should you have known me," she added, turning toward him, "if you had met me now? Should you have known me for the one you saw at Leubronn?" "Yes, I should have known you," said Deronda mournfully. "The outside change is not great. I should have seen at once that it was you, and that you had gone through some great sorrow." "Don't wish now that you had never seen me. Don't wish that," said Gwendolen imploringly, while the tears gathered. "I should despise myself for wishing it," said Deronda. "How could I know what I was wishing? We must find our duties in what comes to us, not in what we imagine might have been. If I took to foolish wishing of that sort, I should wish—not that I had never seen you, but that I had been able to save you from this." "You have saved me from worse," said Gwendolen, in a sobbing voice. "I should have been worse if it had not been for you. If you had not been good, I should have been more wicked than I am." "It will be better for me to go now," said Deronda, worn in spirit by the perpetual strain of this scene. "Remember what we said of your task—to get well and calm before other friends come." He rose as he spoke, and she gave him her hand submissively. But when he had left her, she sank on her knees in hysterical crying. The distance between them was too great. She was a banished soul, beholding a possible life which she had sinned herself away from. She was found in this way, crushed on the floor. Such grief seemed natural in a poor lady whose husband had been drowned in her presence. End of Chapter 57. End of Book 7. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Book 8, Fruit and Seed. Chapter 58. Much ado there was, God wot, he would love and she would not. Nicholas Breton. Extension, we know, is a very imperfect measure of things, and the length of the sun's journeying can no more tell us how life has advanced than the acreage of a field can tell us what growths may be active within it. A man may go south, and stumbling over a bone, may meditate upon it till he has found a new starting point for anatomy; or eastward, and discover a new key to language telling a new story of races; or he may head an expedition that opens new continental pathways, get himself maimed in the body, and go through a whole heroic poem of resolve and endurance. And at the end of a few months he may come back to find his neighbors grumbling at the same parish grievance as before, or to see the same elderly gentleman treading the pavement in discourse with himself, shaking his head after the same percussive butcher's boy, and pausing at the same shop window to look at the same prints. If the swiftest thinking has about the pace of a greyhound, the slowest must be supposed to move like the limpet, by an apparent sticking, which after a good while is discerned to be a slight progression. Such differences are manifest in the variable intensity which we call human experience, from the revolutionary rush of change which makes a new inner and outer life, to that quiet recurrence of the familiar, which has no other epochs than those of hunger and the heavens. Something of this contrast was seen in the year's experience which had turned the brilliant, self-confident Gwendolen Harleth of the archery meeting into the crushed penitent impelled to confess her unworthiness where it would have been her happiness to be held worthy, while it had left her family in Pennicote without deeper change than that of some outward habits, and some adjustment of prospects and intentions to reduced income, fewer visits, and fainter compliments. The rectory was as pleasant a home as before, and the red and pink peonies on the lawn, the rows of hollyhocks by the hedges, had bloomed as well this year as last. The rector maintained his cheerful confidence in the goodwill of patrons and his resolution to deserve it by diligence in the fulfillment of his duties, whether patrons were likely to hear of it or not; doing nothing solely with an eye to promotion except perhaps the writing of 2 ecclesiastical articles, which, having no signature, were attributed to some one else, except by the patrons who had a special copy sent them, and these certainly knew the author, but did not read the articles. The rector, however, chewed no poisonous cud of suspicion on this point. He made marginal notes in his own copies to render them a more interesting loan, and was gratified that the archdeacon and other authorities had nothing to say against the general tenor of his argument. Peaceful authorship, living in the air of the fields and downs, and not in the thrice-breathed breath of criticism, bringing no Dantesque leanness, rather assisting nutrition by complacency, and perhaps giving a more suffusive sense of achievement than the production of a whole Divina Commedia. Then there was the father's recovered delight in his favorite son, which was a happiness outweighing the loss of 1,800 a year. Of whatever nature might be the hidden change wrought in Rex by the disappointment of his first love, it was apparently quite secondary to that evidence of more serious ambition which dated from the family misfortune. Indeed, Mr. Gascoigne was inclined to regard the little affair which had caused him so much anxiety the year before as an evaporation of superfluous moisture, a kind of finish to the baking process which the human dough demands. Rex had lately come down for a summer visit to the rectory, bringing Anna home, and while he showed nearly the old liveliness with his brothers and sisters, he continued in his holiday the habits of the eager student, rising early in the morning and shutting himself up early in the evenings to carry on a fixed course of study. "You don't repent the choice of the law as a profession, Rex?" said his father. "There is no profession I would choose before it," said Rex. "I should like to end my life as a first-rate judge and help to draw up a code. I reverse the famous dictum. I should say, give me something to do with making the laws, and let who will make the songs." "You will have to stow in an immense amount of rubbish, I suppose. That's the worst of it," said the rector. "I don't see that law rubbish is worse than any other sort. It is not so bad as the rubbishy literature that people choke their minds with. It doesn't make one so dull. Our wittiest men have often been lawyers. Any orderly way of looking at things as cases and evidence seems to me better than a perpetual wash of odds and ends bearing on nothing in particular. And then, from a higher point of view, the foundations and the growth of law make the most interesting aspects of philosophy and history. Of course there will be a good deal that is troublesome, drudging, perhaps exasperating. But the great prizes in life can't be won easily. I see that." "Well, my boy, the best augury of a man's success in his profession is that he thinks it the finest in the world. But I fancy it so with most work when a man goes into it with a will. Brewitt, the blacksmith, said to me the other day that his 'prentice had no mind to his trade. And yet, sir, said Brewitt, what would a young fellow have if he doesn't like a blacksmithing?" The rector cherished a fatherly delight, which he allowed to escape him only in moderation. Warham, who had gone to India, he had easily borne parting with, but Rex was that romance of later life which a man sometimes finds in a son whom he recognizes as superior to himself, picturing a future eminence for him according to a variety of famous examples. It was only to his wife that he said with decision, "Rex will be a distinguished man, Nancy, I'm sure of it, as sure as Paley's father was about his son." "Was Paley an old bachelor?" said Mrs. Gascoigne. "That is hardly to the point, my dear," said the rector, who did not remember that irrelevant detail, and Mrs. Gascoigne felt that she had spoken rather weakly. This quiet trotting of time at the rectory was shared by the group who had exchanged the faded dignity of Offendene for the low white house not a mile off, well enclosed with evergreens and known to the villagers as Jodson's. Mrs. Davilow's delicate face showed only a slight deepening of its mild melancholy, her hair only a few more silver lines, in consequence of the last year's trials. The four girls had bloomed out a little from being less in the shade, and the good Jocosa preserved her serviceable neutrality toward the pleasures and glories of the world as things made for those who were not in a situation. The low narrow drawing-room, enlarged by two quaint projecting windows with lattices wide open on a July afternoon to the scent of monthly roses, the faint murmurs of the garden, and the occasional rare sound of hoofs and wheels seeming to clarify the succeeding silence, made rather a crowded, lively scene, Rex and Anna being added to the usual group of six. Anna, always a favorite with her younger cousins, had much to tell of her new experience and the acquaintances she had made in London, and when on her first visit she came alone, many questions were asked her about Gwendolen's house in Grosvenor Square, what Gwendolen herself had said, and what any one else had said about Gwendolen. Had Anna been to see Gwendolen after she had known about the yacht? No, an answer which left speculation free concerning everything connected with that interesting unknown vessel beyond the fact that Gwendolen had written just before she set out to say that Mr. Grandcourt and she were going yachting on the Mediterranean, and again from Marseilles to say that she was sure to like the yachting. The cabins were very elegant, and she would probably not send another letter till she had written quite a long diary filled with dittos. Also, this movement of Mr. and Mrs. Grandcourt had been mentioned in the newspaper, so that altogether this new phase of Gwendolen's exalted life made a striking part of the sisters' romance, the book-devouring Isabel throwing in a corsair or two to make an adventure that might end well. But when Rex was present, the girls, according to instructions, never started this fascinating topic, and to-day there had only been animated descriptions of the Meyricks and their extraordinary Jewish friends, which caused some astonished questioning from minds to which the idea of live Jews, out of a book, suggested a difference deep enough to be almost zoological, as of a strange race in Pliny's Natural History that might sleep under the shade of its own ears. Bertha could not imagine what Jews believed now, and she had a dim idea that they rejected the Old Testament since it proved the New. Miss Mary thought that Mirah and her brother could never have been properly argued with, and the amiable Alice did not mind what the Jews believed. She was sure she couldn't bear them. Miss Davilow corrected her by saying that the great Jewish families who were in society were quite what they ought to be, both in London and Paris, but admitted that the commoner unconverted Jews were objectionable. And Isabel asked whether Mirah talked just as they did, or whether you might be with her and not find out that she was a Jewess. Rex, who had no partisanship with the Israelites, having made a troublesome acquaintance with the minutiae of their ancient history in the form of cram, was amusing himself by playfully exaggerating the notion of each speaker, while Anna begged them all to understand that he was only joking, when the laughter was interrupted by the bringing in of a letter for Mrs. Davilow. A messenger had run with it in great haste from the rectory. It enclosed a telegram, and as Mrs. Davilow read and reread it in silence and agitation, all eyes were turned on her with anxiety, but no one dared to speak. Looking up at last and seeing the young faces, painted with fear, she remembered that they might be imagining something worse than the truth, something like her own first dread, which made her unable to understand what was written. And she said, with a sob which was half relief, "My dears, Mr. Grandcourt." She paused an instant, and then began again, "Mr. Grandcourt is drowned." Rex started up as if a missile had been suddenly thrown into the room. He could not help himself, and Anna's first look was at him. But then, gathering some self-command while Mrs. Davilow was reading what the rector had written on the enclosing paper, he said, "Can I do anything, aunt? Can I carry any word to my father from you?" "Yes, dear. Tell him I will be ready. He is very good. He says he will go with me to Genoa. He will be here at 6:30. Jocosa and Alice, help me to get ready. She is safe. Gwendolen is safe. But she must be ill. I am sure she must be very ill. Rex, dear, Rex and Anna, go and tell your father I will be quite ready. I would not for the world lose another night. And bless him for being ready so soon. I can travel night and day till we get there." Rex and Anna hurried away through the sunshine which was suddenly solemn to them, without uttering a word to each other, she chiefly possessed by solicitude about any reopening of his wound, he struggling with a tumultuary crowd of thoughts that were an offense against his better will. The tumult being undiminished when they were at the rectory gate, he said, "Nanny, I will leave you to say everything to my father. If he wants me immediately, let me know. I shall stay in the shrubbery for 10 minutes. Only 10 minutes." Who has been quite free from egoistic escapes of the imagination, picturing desirable consequences on his own future in the presence of another's misfortune, sorrow, or death. The expected promotion or legacy is the common type of a temptation which makes speech and even prayer a severe avoidance of the most insistent thoughts, and sometimes raises an inward shame, a self-distaste that is worse than any other form of unpleasant companionship. In Rex's nature the shame was immediate, and overspread like an ugly light all the hurrying images of what might come, which thrust themselves in with the idea that Gwendolen was again free, overspread them, perhaps, the more persistently because every phantasm of a hope was quickly nullified by a more substantial obstacle. Before the vision of Gwendolen free rose the impassable vision of Gwendolen rich, exalted, courted; and if in the former time, when both their lives were fresh, she had turned from his love with repugnance, what ground was there for supposing that her heart would be more open to him in the future? These thoughts, which he wanted to master and suspend, were like a tumultuary ringing of opposing chimes that he could not escape from by running. During the last year he had brought himself into a state of calm resolve, and now it seemed that 3 words had been enough to undo all that difficult work and cast him back into the wretched fluctuations of a longing which he recognized as simply perturbing and hopeless. And at this moment the activity of such longing had an untimeliness that made it repulsive to his better self. Excuse poor Rex. It is not much more than 18 months since he had been laid low by an archer who sometimes touches his arrow with a subtle, lingering poison. The disappointment of a youthful passion has effects as incalculable as those of smallpox, which may make one person plain and a genius, another less plain and more foolish, another plain without detriment to his folly, and leave perhaps the majority without obvious change. Everything depends, not on the mere fact of disappointment, but on the nature affected and the force that stirs it. In Rex's well-endowed nature, brief as the hope had been, the passionate stirring had gone deep, and the effect of disappointment was revolutionary, though fraught with a beneficent new order which retained most of the old virtues. In certain respects he believed that it had finally determined the bias and color of his life. Now, however, it seemed that his inward peace was hardly more than that of Republican Florence, and his heart no better than the alarm bell that made work slack and tumult busy. Rex's love had been of that sudden, penetrating, clinging sort which the ancients knew and sung, and in singing made a fashion of talk for many moderns whose experience has by no means a fiery, demonic character. To have the consciousness suddenly steeped with another's personality, to have the strongest inclinations possessed by an image which retains its dominance in spite of change and apart from worthiness, nay, to feel a passion which clings faster for the tragic pangs inflicted by a cruel reorganized unworthiness, is a phase of love which in the feeble and common-minded has a repulsive likeness to his blind animalism, insensible to the higher sway of moral affinity or heaven-lit admiration. But when this attaching force is present in a nature not of brutish unmodifiableness, but of a human dignity that can risk itself safely, it may even result in a devotedness not unfit to be called divine in a higher sense than the ancient. Phlegmatic rationality stares and shakes its head at these unaccountable prepossessions, but they exist as undeniably as the winds and waves, determining here a wreck and there a triumphant voyage. This sort of passion had nested in the sweet-natured, strong Rex, and he had made up his mind to its companionship, as if it had been an object supremely dear, stricken dumb and helpless, and turning all the future of tenderness into a shadow of the past. But he had also made up his mind that his life was not to be pauperized because he had had to renounce one sort of joy. Rather, he had begun life again with a new counting up of the treasures that remained to him, and he had even felt a release of power such as may come from ceasing to be afraid of your own neck. And now here he was pacing in the shrubbery, angry with himself that the sense of irrevocableness in his lot, which ought in reason to have been as strong as ever, had been shaken by a change of circumstances that could make no change in relation to him. He told himself the truth quite roughly. "She would never love me, and that is not the question. I could never approach her as a lover in her present position. I am exactly of no consequence at all, and am not likely to be of much consequence till my head is turning gray. But what has that to do with it? She would not have me on any terms, and I would not ask her. It is a meanness to be thinking about it now, no better than lurking about the battlefield to strip the dead. But there never was a more gratuitous sinning. I have nothing to gain there, absolutely nothing. Then why can't I face the facts, and behave as they demand, instead of leaving my father to suppose that there are matters he can't speak to me about, though I might be useful in them?" The last thought made one wave with the impulse that sent Rex walking firmly into the house and through the open door of the study, where he saw his father packing a traveling desk. "Can I be of any use, sir?" said Rex, with rallied courage, as his father looked up at him. "Yes, my boy. When I'm gone, just see to my letters, and answer where necessary, and send me word of everything. Dymock will manage the parish very well, and you will stay with your mother, or at least go up and down again till I come back, whenever that may be." "You will hardly be very long, sir, I suppose," said Rex, beginning to strap a railway rug. "You will perhaps bring my cousin back to England?" He forced himself to speak of Gwendolen for the first time, and the rector noticed the epoch with satisfaction. "That depends," he answered, taking the subject as a matter of course between them. "Perhaps her mother may stay there with her, and I may come back very soon. This telegram leaves us in ignorance, which is rather anxious. But no doubt the arrangements of the will lately made are satisfactory, and there may possibly be an heir yet to be born. In any case, I feel confident that Gwendolen will be liberally, I should expect splendidly, provided for." "It must have been a great shock for her," said Rex, getting more resolute after the first twinge had been borne. "I suppose he was a devoted husband." "No doubt of it," said the rector in his most decided manner. "Few men of his position would have come forward as he did under the circumstances." Rex had never seen Grandcourt, had never been spoken to about him by any one of the family, and knew nothing of Gwendolen's flight from her suitor to Leubronn. He only knew that Grandcourt, being very much in love with her, had made her an offer in the first weeks of her sudden poverty, and had behaved very handsomely in providing for her mother and sisters. That was all very natural, and what Rex himself would have liked to do. Grandcourt had been a lucky fellow, and had had some happiness before he got drowned. Yet Rex wondered much whether Gwendolen had been in love with the successful suitor, or had only forborne to tell him that she hated being made love to. End of Chapter 58. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda, by George Eliot. Chapter 59. I count myself in nothing else so happy as in a soul remembering my good friends. Shakespeare. Sir Hugo Mallinger was not so prompt in starting for Genoa as Mr. Gascoigne had been, and Deronda on all accounts would not take his departure until he had seen the baronet. There was not only Grandcourt's death, but also the late crisis in his own life to make reasons why his oldest friend would desire to have the unrestrained communication of speech with him, for in writing he had not felt able to give any details concerning the mother who had come and gone like an apparition. It was not till the 5th evening that Deronda, according to telegram, waited for Sir Hugo at the station, where he was to arrive between 8 and 9. And while he was looking forward to the sight of the kind, familiar face, which was part of his earliest memories, something like a smile, in spite of his late tragic experience, might have been detected in his eyes and the curve of his lips at the idea of Sir Hugo's pleasure in being now master of his estates, able to leave them to his daughters, or at least, according to a view of inheritance which had just been strongly impressed on Deronda's imagination, to take makeshift feminine offspring as intermediate to a satisfactory heir in a grandson. We should be churlish creatures if we could have no joy in our fellow mortals' joy, unless it were in agreement with our theory of righteous distribution and our highest ideal of human good. What sour corners our mouths would get, our eyes, what frozen glances! And all the while our own possessions and desires would not exactly adjust themselves to our ideal. We must have some comradeship with imperfection, and it is happily possible to feel gratitude even where we discern a mistake that may have been injurious, the vehicle of the mistake being an affectionate intention prosecuted through a lifetime of kindly offices. Deronda's feeling and judgment were strongly against the action of Sir Hugo in making himself the agent of a falsity. Yes, a falsity. He could give no milder name to the concealment under which he had been reared. But the baronet had probably had no clear knowledge concerning the mother's breach of trust, and with his light, easy way of taking life, had held it a reasonable preference in her that her son should be made an English gentleman, seeing that she had the eccentricity of not caring to part from her child, and be to him as if she were not. Daniel's affectionate gratitude toward Sir Hugo made him wish to find grounds of excuse rather than blame, for it is as possible to be rigid in principle and tender in blame as it is to suffer from the sight of things hung awry, and yet to be patient with the hanger who sees amiss. If Sir Hugo in his bachelorhood had been beguiled into regarding children chiefly as a product intended to make life more agreeable to the full-grown, whose convenience alone was to be consulted in the disposal of them, why he had shared an assumption which, if not formally avowed, was massively acted on at that date of the world's history. And Deronda, with all his keen memory of the painful inward struggle he had gone through in his boyhood, was able also to remember the many signs that his experience had been entirely shut out from Sir Hugo's conception. Ignorant kindness may have the effect of cruelty, but to be angry with it as if it were direct cruelty would be an ignorant unkindness, the most remote from Deronda's large imaginative lenience towards others. And perhaps now, after the searching scenes of the last 10 days, in which the curtain had been lifted for him from the secrets of lives unlike his own, he was more than ever disposed to check that rashness of indignation or resentment which has an unpleasant likeness to the love of punishing. When he saw Sir Hugo's familiar figure descending from the railway carriage, the lifelong affection which had been well accustomed to make excuses flowed in and submerged all newer knowledge that might have seemed fresh ground for blame. "Well, Dan," said Sir Hugo with a serious fervor, grasping Deronda's hand. He uttered no other words of greeting. There was too strong a rush of mutual consciousness. The next thing was to give orders to the courier, and then to propose walking slowly in the mild evening, there being no hurry to get to the hotel. "I have taken my journey easily, and I'm in excellent condition," he said, as he and Deronda came out under the starlight, which was still faint with the lingering sheen of day. "I didn't hurry in setting off, because I wanted to inquire into things a little, and so I got sight of your letter to Lady Mallinger before I started. But now, how is the widow?" "Getting calmer," said Deronda. "She seems to be escaping the bodily illness that one might have feared for her, after her plunge and terrible excitement. Her uncle and mother came 2 days ago, and she is being well taken care of." "Any prospect of an heir being born?" "From what Mr. Gascoigne said to me, I conclude not. He spoke as if it were a question whether the widow would have the estates for her life." "It will not be much of a wrench to her affections, I fancy, this loss of the husband?" said Sir Hugo, looking round at Deronda. "The suddenness of the death has been a great blow to her," said Deronda, quietly evading the question. "I wonder whether Grandcourt gave her any notion what were the provisions of his will?" said Sir Hugo. "Do you know what they are, sir?" parried Deronda. "Yes, I do," said the baronet quickly. Gad, if there is no prospect of a legitimate heir, he has left everything to a boy he had by a Mrs. Glasher. You know nothing about the affair, I suppose, but she was a sort of wife to him for a good many years, and there are 3 older children, girls. The boy is to take his father's name. He is Henleigh already, and he is to be Henleigh Mallinger Grandcourt. The Mallinger will be of no use to him, I'm happy to say. But the young dog will have more than enough with his 14 years' minority. No need to have had holes filled up with my 50,000 for Diplow that he had no right to. And meanwhile, my beauty, the young widow, is to put up with a poor 2,000 a year and the house at Gadsmere. A nice kind of banishment for her if she chose to shut herself up there, which I don't think she will. The boy's mother has been living there of late years. I'm perfectly disgusted with Grandcourt. I don't know that I'm obliged to think the better of him because he's drowned, though so far as my affairs are concerned, nothing in his life became him like the leaving it. In my opinion, he did wrong when he married this wife, not in leaving his estates to the son," said Deronda rather dryly. "I say nothing against his leaving the land to the lad," said Sir Hugo. "But since he had married this girl he ought to have given her a handsome provision, such as she could live on in a style fitted to the rank he had raised her to. She ought to have had 4,000 or 5,000 a year and the London house for her life. That's what I should have done for her. I suppose, as she was penniless, her friends couldn't stand out for a settlement, else it's ill trusting to the will a man may make after he's married. Even a wise man generally lets some folly ooze out of him in his will. My father did, I know, and if a fellow has any spite or tyranny in him, he's likely to bottle off a good deal for keeping in that sort of document. It's quite clear Grandcourt meant that his death should put an extinguisher on his wife if she bore him no heir. And in the other case I suppose everything would have been reversed. Illegitimacy would have had the extinguisher," said Deronda with some scorn. "Precisely. Gadsmere and the 2,000. It's queer. One nuisance is that Grandcourt has made me an executor. But seeing he was the son of my only brother, I can't refuse to act. And I shall mind it less if I can be of any use to the widow. Lush thinks she was not in ignorance about the family under the rose and the purport of the will. He hints that there was no very good understanding between the couple. But I fancy you are the man who knew most about what Mrs. Grandcourt felt or did not feel. Eh, Dan?" Sir Hugo did not put this question with his usual jocoseness, but rather with a lowered tone of interested inquiry, and Deronda felt that any evasion would be misinterpreted. He answered gravely, "She was certainly not happy. They were unsuited to each other. But as to the disposal of the property, from all I have seen of her, I should predict that she will be quite contented with it." "Then she is not much like the rest of her sex, that's all I can say," said Sir Hugo with a slight shrug. "However, she ought to be something extraordinary, for there must be an entanglement between your horoscope and hers, eh?" When that tremendous telegram came, the first thing Lady Mallinger said was, "How very strange that it should be Daniel who sends it! But I have had something of the same sort in my own life. I was once at a foreign hotel where a lady had been left by her husband without money. When I heard of it and came forward to help her, who should she be but an early flame of mine, who had been fool enough to marry an Austrian baron with a long mustache and short affection. But it was an affair of my own that called me there, nothing to do with knight-errantry any more than you coming to Genoa had to do with the Grandcourts." There was silence for a little while. Sir Hugo had begun to talk of the Grandcourts as the less difficult subject between himself and Deronda, but they were both wishing to overcome a reluctance to perfect frankness on the events which touched their relation to each other. Deronda felt that his letter, after the first interview with his mother, had been rather a thickening than a breaking of the ice, and that he ought to wait for the first opening to come from Sir Hugo. Just when they were about to lose sight of the port, the baronet turned, and pausing as if to get a last view, said in a tone of more serious feeling, "And about the main business of your coming to Genoa, Dan? You have not been deeply pained by anything you have learned, I hope. There is nothing that you feel need change your position in any way? You know, whatever happens to you must always be of importance to me." "I desire to meet your goodness by perfect confidence, sir," said Deronda. "But I can't answer those questions truly by a simple yes or no. Much that I have heard about the past has pained me, and it has been a pain to meet and part with my mother in her suffering state, as I have been compelled to do. But it is no pain. It is rather a clearing up of doubts for which I am thankful, to know my parentage. As to the effect on my position, there will be no change in my gratitude to you, sir, for the fatherly care and affection you have always shown me. But to know that I was born a Jew may have a momentous influence on my life, which I am hardly able to tell you of at present." Deronda spoke the last sentence with a resolve that overcame some diffidence. He felt that the differences between Sir Hugo's nature and his own would have by and by to disclose themselves more markedly than had ever yet been needful. The baronet gave him a quick glance and turned to walk on. After a few moments' silence, in which he had reviewed all the material in his memory which would enable him to interpret Deronda's words, he said, "I have long expected something remarkable from you, Dan. But for God's sake don't go into any eccentricities. I can tolerate any man's difference of opinion, but let him tell it me without getting himself up as a lunatic. At this stage of the world, if a man wants to be taken seriously, he must keep clear of melodrama. Don't misunderstand me. I am not suspecting you of setting up any lunacy on your own account. I only think you might easily be led arm in arm with a lunatic, especially if he wanted defending. You have a passion for people who are pelted, Dan. I'm sorry for them too, but so far as company goes, it's a bad ground of selection. However, I don't ask you to anticipate your inclination in anything you have to tell me. When you make up your mind to a course that requires money, I have some £16,000 that have been accumulating for you, over and above what you have been having the interest of as income. And now I am come, I suppose you want to get back to England as soon as you can?" "I must go first to Mainz to get away a chest of my grandfather's, and perhaps to see a friend of his," said Deronda. "Although the chest has been lying there these 20 years, I have an unreasonable sort of nervous eagerness to get it away under my care, as if it were more likely now than before that something might happen to it. And perhaps I am the more uneasy because I lingered after my mother left, instead of setting out immediately. Yet I can't regret that I was here, else Mrs. Grandcourt would have had none but servants to act for her." "Yes, yes," said Sir Hugo, with a flippancy which was an escape of some vexation hidden under his more serious speech. "I just hope you are not going to set a dead Jew above a living Christian." Deronda colored and repressed a retort. They were just turning into the Italia. Chapter 59. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda, by George Eliot. Chapter 60. But I shall say no more of this at this time, for this is to be felt and not to be talked of. And they who never touched it with their fingers may secretly perhaps laugh at it in their hearts and be never the wiser. Jeremy Taylor. The Roman emperor in the legend put to death 10 learned Israelites to avenge the sale of Joseph by his brethren. And there have always been enough of his kidney, whose piety lies in punishing who can see the justice of grudges but not of gratitude. For you shall never convince the stronger feeling that it hath not the stronger reason, or incline him who hath no love to believe that there is good ground for loving, as we may learn from the order of word-making, wherein love precedeth lovable. When Deronda presented his letter at the banking house in the Schusterstrasse at Mainz, and asked for Joseph Kalonymos, he was presently shown into an inner room, where, seated at a table arranging open letters, was the white-bearded man whom he had seen the year before in the synagogue at Frankfort. He wore his hat. It seemed to be the same old felt hat as before, and near him was a packed portmanteau, with a wrap and overcoat upon it. On seeing Deronda enter he rose, but did not advance or put out his hand. Looking at him with small penetrating eyes which glittered like black gems in the midst of his yellowish face and white hair, he said in German, "Good! It is now you who seek me, young man." "Yes, I seek you with gratitude, as a friend of my grandfather's," said Deronda, "and I am under an obligation to you for giving yourself much trouble on my account." He spoke without difficulty in that liberal German tongue which takes many strange accents to its maternal bosom. Kalonymos now put out his hand and said cordially, "So you are no longer angry at being something more than an Englishman?" "On the contrary, I thank you heartily for helping to save me from remaining in ignorance of my parentage, and for taking care of the chest that my grandfather left in trust for me." "Sit down, sit down," said Kalonymos in a quick undertone, seating himself again and pointing to a chair near him. Then deliberately laying aside his hat, and showing a head thickly covered with white hair, he stroked and clutched his beard while he looked examiningly at the young face before him. The moment wrought strongly on Deronda's imaginative susceptibility. In the presence of one linked still in zealous friendship with the grandfather whose hope had yearned toward him when he was unborn, and who though dead was yet to speak with him in those written memorials which, says Milton, contain a potency of life in them to be as active as the soul whose progeny they are, he seemed to himself to be touching the electric chain of his own ancestry, and he bore the scrutinizing look of Kalonymos with a delighted awe, something like what one feels in the solemn commemoration of acts done long ago but still telling markedly on the life of today. Impossible for men of duller fiber, men whose affection is not ready to diffuse itself through the wide travel of imagination, to comprehend, perhaps even to credit this sensibility of Deronda's. But it subsisted, like their own dullness, notwithstanding their lack of belief in it, and it gave his face an expression which seemed very satisfactory to the observer. He said in Hebrew, quoting from one of the fine hymns in the Hebrew liturgy, "As thy goodness has been great to the former generations, even so may it be to the latter." Then, after pausing a little, he began, "Young man, I rejoice that I was not yet set off again in my travels, and that you were come in time for me to see the image of my friend as he was in his youth, no longer perverted from the fellowship of your people, no longer shrinking in proud wrath from the touch of him who seemed to be claiming you as a Jew. You come with thankfulness yourself to claim the kindred and heritage that wicked contrivance would have robbed you of. You come with a willing soul to declare, 'I am the grandson of Daniel Charisi.' Is it not so?" "Assuredly it is," said Deronda. "But let me say that I should at no time have been inclined to treat a Jew with incivility simply because he was a Jew. You can understand that I shrink from saying to a stranger, 'I know nothing of my mother.'" "A sin! A sin!" said Kalonymos, putting up his hand and closing his eyes in disgust. "A robbery of our people, as when our youths and maidens were reared for the Roman Edom. But it is frustrated. I have frustrated it. When Daniel Charisi, may his rock and his Redeemer guard him, when Daniel Charisi was a stripling and I was a lad little above his shoulder, we made a solemn vow always to be friends. He said, 'Let us bind ourselves with duty as if we were sons of the same mother.' That was his bent from first to last, as he said, to fortify his soul with bonds. It was a saying of his, 'Let us bind love with duty, for duty is the love of law, and law is the nature of the eternal.' So we bound ourselves, and though we were much apart in our later life, the bond has never been broken. When he was dead, they sought to rob him, but they could not rob him of me. I rescued that remainder of him which he had prized and preserved for his offspring, and I have restored to him the offspring they had robbed him of. I will bring you the chest forthwith." Kalonymos left the room for a few minutes, and returned with a clerk who carried the chest, set it down on the floor, drew off a leather cover, and went out again. It was not very large, but was made heavy by ornamental bracers and handles of gilt iron. The wood was beautifully incised with Arabic lettering. "So," said Kalonymos, returning to his seat. "And here is the curious key," he added, taking it from a small leathern bag. "Bestow it carefully. I trust you are methodic and wary." He gave Deronda the monitory and slightly suspicious look with which age is apt to commit any object to the keeping of youth. "I shall be more careful of this than of any other property," said Deronda, smiling and putting the key in his breast pocket. "I never before possessed anything that was a sign to me of so much cherished hope and effort, and I shall never forget that the effort was partly yours. Have you time to tell me more of my grandfather, or shall I be trespassing and staying longer?" "Stay yet a while. In an hour and 18 minutes I start for Trieste," said Kalonymos, looking at his watch, "and presently my sons will expect my attention. Will you let me make you known to them, so that they may have the pleasure of showing hospitality to my friend's grandson? They dwell here in ease and luxury, though I choose to be a wanderer. I shall be glad if you will commend me to their acquaintance for some future opportunity," said Deronda. "There are pressing claims calling me to England, friends who may be much in need of my presence. I have been kept away from them too long by unexpected circumstances. But to know more of you and your family would be motive enough to bring me again to Mainz." "Good! Me you will hardly find, for I am beyond my 60 years and 10, and I am a wanderer, carrying my shroud with me. But my sons and their children dwell here in wealth and unity. The days are changed for us, since Karl the Great fetched my ancestors from Italy to bring some tincture of knowledge to our rough German brethren. I and my contemporaries have had to fight for it too. Our youth fell on evil days, but this we have won. We increase our wealth in safety, and the learning of all Germany is fed and fattened by Jewish brains, though they keep not always their Jewish hearts. Have you been left altogether ignorant of your people's life, young man?" "No," said Deronda. "I have lately, before I had any true suspicion of my parentage, been led to study everything belonging to their history with more interest than in any other subject. It turns out that I have been making myself ready to understand my grandfather a little." He was anxious lest the time should be consumed before this circuitous course of talk could lead them back to the topic he most cared about. Age does not easily distinguish between what it needs to express and what youth needs to know, distance seeming to level the objects of memory. And keenly active as Joseph Kalonymos showed himself, an inkstand in the wrong place would have hindered his imagination from getting to Beirut. He had been used to unite restless travel with punctilious observation. But Deronda's last sentence answered its purpose. "So you would perhaps have been such a man as he if your education had not hindered, for you are like him in features. Yet not altogether, young man. He had an iron will in his face. It braced up everybody about him. When he was quite young he had already got one deep upright line in his brow. I see none of that in you. Daniel Carisi used to say, 'Better a wrong will than a wavering, better a steadfast enemy than an uncertain friend, better a false belief than no belief at all.' What he despised most was indifference. He had longer reasons than I can give you." "Yet his knowledge was not narrow," said Deronda, with a tacit reference to the usual excuse for indecision, that it comes from knowing too much. "Narrow? No," said Kalonymos, shaking his head with a compassionate smile. "From his childhood upward he drank in learning as easily as the plant sucks up water. But he early took to medicine and theories about life and health. He traveled to many countries, and spent much of his substance in seeing and knowing. What he used to insist on was that the strength and wealth of mankind depended on the balance of separateness and communication, and he was bitterly against our people losing themselves among the Gentiles. "It's no better," said he, "than the many sorts of grain going back from their variety into sameness." He mingled all sorts of learning, and in that he was like our Arabic writers in the golden time. We studied together, but he went beyond me. Though we were bosom friends, and he poured himself out to me, we were as different as the inside and outside of the bowl. I stood up for two notions of my own. I took Carizi's sayings as I took the shape of the trees. They were there, not to be disputed about. It came to the same thing in both of us. We were both faithful Jews, thankful not to be Gentiles. And since I was a right man, I have been what I am now, for all but age-loving to wander, loving transactions, loving to behold all things, and caring nothing about hardship. Carizi thought continually of our people's future. He went with all his soul into that part of our religion. I not. So we have freedom. I am content. Our people wandered before they were driven. Young man, when I am in the East, I lie much on deck and watch the greater stars. The sight of them satisfies me. I know them as they rise, and hunger not to know more. Carizi was satisfied with no sight, but pieced it out with what had been before and what would come after. Yet we loved each other, and as he said, he bound our love with duty. We solemnly pledged ourselves to help and defend each other to the last. I have fulfilled my pledge." Here Kalonymos rose, and Deronda, rising also, said, "And in being faithful to him, you have caused justice to be done to me. It would have been a robbery of me too that I should never have known of the inheritance he had prepared for me. I thank you with my whole soul. Be worthy of him, young man. What is your vocation?" This question was put with a quick abruptness which embarrassed Deronda, who did not feel it quite honest to allege his law reading as a vocation. He answered, "I cannot say that I have any." "Get one! Get one! The Jew must be diligent. You will call yourself a Jew and profess the faith of your fathers?" said Kalonymos, putting his hand on Deronda's shoulder and looking sharply in his face. "I shall call myself a Jew," said Deronda, deliberately, becoming slightly paler under the piercing eyes of his questioner. "But I will not say that I shall profess to believe exactly as my fathers have believed. Our fathers themselves changed the horizon of their belief, and learned of other races. But I think I can maintain my grandfather's notion of separateness with communication. I hold that my first duty is to my own people, and if there is anything to be done toward restoring or perfecting their common life, I shall make that my vocation." It happened to Deronda at that moment, as it has often happened to others, that the need for speech made an epoch in resolve. His respect for the questioner would not let him decline to answer, and by the necessity to answer he found out the truth for himself. "Ah, you argue and look forward. You are Daniel Carizi's grandson," said Kalonymos, adding a benediction in Hebrew. With that they parted, and almost as soon as Deronda was in London, the aged man was again on shipboard, greeting the friendly stars without any eager curiosity. End of Chapter 60. This recording is in the public domain.